Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at, have you heard George's podcast?
Okay.
So this one's really cool because it brings in a lot of different things. It's got drama in there, it's got music,
hmm
there's poetry.
Yeah, a really interesting mix.
Yeah, and like they all kind of weave together around these discussions, you know.
It's not just like separate elements, it all really flows together.
And you know what else is cool about this? It won
Oh, yeah.
a Peabody Award. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it is.
And usually you only see like American stuff winning that, right?
Yeah, for the most part. So it's definitely unusual for a British production.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that kind of tells you right there that we're dealing with something pretty special.
Definitely groundbreaking.
Yeah. And today we're going to really try to understand what makes this podcast tick. We're going to be looking at like how it fits into the whole BBC strategy. Reaching a younger audience, a more diverse audience. And we're going to talk about how technology is changing the game for radio, like with podcasts and all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then just like how George the Poet is really pushing the boundaries with this thing. He's doing something totally new.
Yeah, he's not afraid to experiment at all.
So let's start with the BBC. We all know they've gotten some flack for sometimes catering to like a more traditional audience, right? A little bit more white, middle class.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. They've had their share of criticism for sure.
Yeah, and it's not just like people complaining on Twitter. I mean, there was that Ofcom report back in 2017
Right.
that kind of laid it all out there, didn't it?
Yeah, it definitely highlighted that gap between the BBC's output and the actual diversity of the UK population.
And to their credit, they did respond
Yeah, they took it seriously. They came out with their diversity and inclusion plan in 2021.
with those big targets.
Yeah, they set some pretty ambitious goals for representation, both in their workforce and in their programming.
Like that 50-20-12 target, right?
Yeah, that was a big one, aiming for 50% of their workforce to be women, 20% Black, Asian, or minority ethnic, and 12% disabled.
Big goals.
Absolutely. And it shows that they're really trying to move in the right direction.
Right. So have you heard George's podcast fit into all of this?
Well, that's what's so fascinating. This podcast, it's not just a great show, it's also a key part of their strategy.
Oh, interesting. So it's more than just entertainment, it's strategic.
Exactly. They're using it to showcase their commitment to reaching these younger, more diverse audiences.
Okay, I get that, but like how do they actually do that? What is it about this specific podcast that speaks to those audiences?
Well, look at George the Poet himself. His background, his voice, the themes he explores, it all really resonates with the younger generation, particularly those from Black and minority ethnic communities.
That makes sense.
And the way he tackles issues like social justice, identity, trauma, it's fresh, it's thought-provoking, it's engaging.
Yeah, I can see that.
He's not shying away from tough topics, but he's doing it through art and storytelling.
So it's not just a lecture, it's an experience.
Exactly. Like that episode, Sabrina's Boy, it explores trauma through Black art.
Whoa.
Powerful stuff, right? And this kind of subject matter, it might not get the same attention in more traditional formats.
Yeah, you're right. Like, could you even imagine this kind of podcast on commercial radio?
It's hard to say.
I mean, wouldn't they be worried about like alienating some listeners?
Possibly, yeah. Commercial pressures often dictate content.
And format too.
Exactly. They got to play it safe to keep those advertisers happy.
Right. But the BBC, they have the license fee
Right, which gives them more freedom.
to experiment, take risks.
Absolutely. And have you heard George's podcast? Is a perfect example of that. It's a testament to the power of public service broadcasting.
To give a platform to voices that might not otherwise be heard.
Precisely. It's about representing the diversity of the UK, not just catering to the mainstream.
And let's not forget, this is a podcast. It's not bound by the same limitations as traditional radio, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a completely different beast.
Like on-demand listening, you can binge it, you can go back and listen again,
Yeah, it's much more flexible.
and you can get into those deeper, more complex topics that you might not have time for in a regular radio show.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons podcasts have become so popular.
Yeah, it's like a whole new world.
It is. And it's changing how we consume audio content.
It's like the evolution of radio, isn't it?
In a way, yeah. And have you heard George's podcast is right at the forefront of that evolution?
I mean, look at shows like This American Life.
Right. Huge phenomenon.
Yeah, podcasts have become a cultural force.
They have. And they're opening up doors for so many creators and voices that might not have had a chance on traditional radio.
And speaking of voices, George the Poet, He's not afraid to be different with his format either.
Oh, absolutely. He's mixing genres, playing with language. It's very creative.
He's jumping between like highbrow stuff, and then you've got like London slang in there.
Yeah, it's a really unique blend.
And it totally works. It keeps you on your toes, makes you think.
Yeah, it's engaging. It challenges the way we think about storytelling.
And again, probably something that wouldn't fly on commercial radio, right?
Probably not. It's too unconventional, too risky.
Right. But that's the beauty of this podcast. It can take those risks, push those boundaries.
And that's what makes it so exciting.
But there is one thing that traditional radio has that podcasts don't. That real-time interaction.
Yeah, you're right.
No call-ins, no live chats, nothing like that.
Yeah, it's a different kind of engagement.
But you know what? George the Poet has kind of found a way around that, hasn't he?
Oh,
So, with that Common Ground platform he created,
right.
it's online, right?
Yeah, it's a website.
And it's like a place for listeners to connect with each other.
Exactly. Discuss the episodes, share their thoughts.
And even get creative themselves, right?
Yes. There are prompts, opportunities for people to make their own art, their own poetry.
Wow, that's brilliant.
It is. It's like he's building a community around the podcast.
Yeah, a space for dialogue, for creative expression.
And it really taps into those ideas about active audiences that we see in media theory.
Like Clay Shirky stuff.
Exactly. Audiences aren't just passively consuming anymore. They want to participate.
They want to be part of the conversation.
And Common Ground gives them that opportunity.
And it reminds me of Henry Jenkins' work on fandom, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Creating that shared experience, that sense of belonging.
And the BBC is really embracing this, too, with their BBC Sounds app.
Oh, yeah, that's a great platform, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all about bringing together different audio content, live radio, podcasts, music.
And it's a great example of how technology is changing the way we consume media, making it more personalized, more interactive.
Absolutely. It's the future of audio, and Have You Heard Georgie's podcast is leading the way.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the BBC, about podcasts in general, but let's bring it back to Have You Heard George's podcast for a sec? There's one episode I really want to mention, A Grenfell Story.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful one.
It's about the Grenfell Tower fire, right?
Yeah, a truly heartbreaking event.
And this episode, it gives voice to that community, to those who were affected by the tragedy.
In a really sensitive and respectful way.
Yeah, it avoids any kind of sensationalism, It focuses on the human impact of the fire.
And it's a reminder of the BBC's obligation to represent the diverse nature of British culture.
Right. I mean, they have a responsibility to tell these stories.
And A Grenfell Story is a powerful example of how they can do that effectively, using the podcast format to give a platform to marginalized communities.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about the BBC's push for diversity, the power of podcasts, but Have You Heard George's podcast is also interesting because it challenges some of those big media theories we always talk about.
Oh, interesting. Like which ones?
Well, like Curran and Seaton, their ideas about media concentration.
Right, how media ownership can influence content.
And the profit motive, how it can sometimes lead to less diverse content,
Yeah, catering to the masses instead of taking risks.
Exactly. But Have You Heard George's podcast? It's funded by the BBC, so it's not driven by those same commercial pressures.
Right. It can afford to be more experimental, more challenging.
It can prioritize telling those diverse, important stories without worrying about, like, upsetting advertisers or chasing ratings.
And that makes it a really powerful example of how public service broadcasting can support innovation and diversity in media.
Yeah, it's like they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. They're not just talking about diversity. They're actively creating spaces for it.
Okay, so we've talked about ownership and diversity, but now I want to touch on something else. Regulation.
Okay.
The BBC, they have all these rules, right? Especially when it comes to sensitive content.
Oh, yeah, like The Watershed, for example.
Yeah, for broadcast television. But Have You Heard George's podcast? It's on demand, so it doesn't have to follow those same rules, does it?
That's right. As a podcast, it has a bit more freedom.
But even though they don't have to, they still include warnings about potentially mature content, right?
Yeah, which shows a commitment to responsible content creation, even within a less regulated space.
It's like they're finding that balance, aren't they?
Exactly. They're navigating the complexities of this new media landscape while still upholding ethical standards.
And it makes you think about those ideas from Livingston and Lunt,
About regulation in the digital age.
Yeah, they argue that new media is really hard to regulate.
Right, because it's so decentralized, so constantly evolving.
But Have You Heard George's podcast?
Yeah.
Shows that it's not impossible, right?
Exactly. It's about finding creative solutions, working within the existing frameworks to ensure responsible content creation.
So it's like a case study, almost, for how to do it right.
I think so, yeah. It's a model for other creators to look to.
And it's all happening within this really interesting social and cultural context, right? I mean, we're living in a time where diversity and inclusion are at the forefront of so many conversations.
Absolutely. You can't ignore the impact of movements like Black Lives Matter.
In events like the Grenfell Tower fire.
Right. They've forced us to confront these issues of systemic inequality.
And it feels like, if you heard George's podcast,
Yeah.
is tapping into that, you know?
Oh, definitely. It's engaging with these conversations, giving voice to those who have been marginalized.
And it's challenging us to think critically about the world around us.
And to consider different perspectives, different experiences.
Okay, so we've talked about the BBC, diversity, the power of podcasts.
Yeah.
But now I want to bring it back to audience who's actually listening to this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about Radio 5 Live's demographic, that more traditional audience.
Yeah, middle-aged, affluent, mostly male.
Do you think, have you heard George's podcast is reaching them?
I'm not so sure. It definitely feels like they're trying to attract a younger, more diverse listenership. People who are looking for something different, something that speaks to their experiences.
And that raises a really interesting question, doesn't it?
What's that?
How do different audiences actually interpret this podcast?
Oh, that's a great question. It takes us back to Stuart Hall's reception theory.
Right, the idea that there's no one right way to interpret a text.
Exactly. It depends on the audience's background, their experiences, their beliefs.
So a middle-aged white listener from a wealthy background might have a completely different understanding of the podcast compared to, say, a young Black British listener from a working-class background.
Absolutely. And that's what makes analyzing media so fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, there are so many layers to unpack.
And have you heard George's podcast? Provides a lot of rich material for that kind of analysis.
It really does. And it all circles back to this idea of diversity, doesn't it?
In so many ways.
The BBC's commitment to diversity, the diversity of voices being represented, the diversity of audience interpretations.
It's all connected.
And it makes you wonder, are they really meeting those diversity targets they set?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Are they walking the walk or just talking the talk?
And I think, have you heard George's podcast?
Yeah.
Is a good example of how they're trying to walk the walk.
Yeah, but there's always more work to be done, right?
Absolutely. It's an ongoing process.
And it brings up some interesting theoretical perspectives too, doesn't it?
Like what?
Well, like Van Zunen's feminist theory, for example.
Oh, you got a good one.
Does this podcast challenge those traditional gender and racial stereotypes by showcasing these diverse voices?
I think it definitely has the potential to do that.
And we can't forget Henry Jenkins' ideas about fandom either.
Right. How fans actively engage with content and create their own meanings.
And have you heard George's podcast? It seems to be inspiring that kind of fan engagement, doesn't it?
Definitely. With common ground and the conversations happening online, it's fostering a real sense of community.
So before we move on, I just want to take a second to kind of recap what we've covered.
Yeah, good idea.
We've talked about the BBC's push for diversity, the evolution of radio through podcasting, and how Have You Heard George's podcast is kind of sitting right at the intersection of those two trends.
Right, and challenging conventions along the way.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much more to explore.
I know, I can't wait to dive deeper. It's like, Have You Heard George's podcast is kind of rewriting the rules of radio, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
We were talking about that format, how it's all mixed up.
Yeah, the poetry, the music.
Yeah, all that.
And like the social commentary woven through it all.
Right. And I think that's what makes it so significant.
Okay, so like, why is that such a big deal?
Well, think about traditional radio, you know?
Yeah.
It's very linear.
Like predictable.
Yeah. You kind of know what to expect.
Stuck in a time slot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But podcasts, they break free from all that.
They're like out in the wild.
Yeah, they can roam free. And have you heard George's podcast? It really embraces that freedom.
So it's not just a radio show on a different platform. It's like a different animal altogether.
Exactly. It's more fluid, more like lyrical almost.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
And it's not random. You know,
It's all very intentional.
yeah, it's all very carefully chosen, each element, to create this like really rich experience for the listener.
It's like he's painting a picture with sound.
Yeah, I like that.
You know, this whole thing kind of makes me think about those big media theories we talk about,
Oh, yeah. Like what?
like Curran and Seaton.
Right, with the media concentration.
Yeah, their ideas about how ownership can impact content.
They argue that concentrated ownership, it often leads to less diversity, less risk-taking.
Right. because they're all about the bottom line.
Yeah, gotta please those shareholders.
But have you heard George's podcast?
Yeah.
It's produced by the BBC.
Right.
So it's public service broadcasting.
Mhm.
They're not beholden to those same commercial pressures, are they?
Exactly, which is why they can be more experimental.
Yeah, they can focus on quality, on representing different voices.
Without worrying about ratings or advertising revenue.
It's kind of like a breath of fresh air, isn't it?
It is. In the media landscape, for sure.
And this all ties into the question of audience, too, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Who are they making this podcast for?
Well, we talked about Radio 5 Live and their typical listener.
Yeah, that kind of older, affluent demographic.
Right. Mostly male.
Do you think, have you heard George's podcast is reaching those same people?
You know, I don't think so.
Me either.
It feels like they're trying to attract a younger crowd, for sure.
Yeah, and a more diverse audience.
Exactly. People who are more open to experimenting, to hearing different perspectives.
And I think that makes this whole question of interpretation even more interesting.
Oh, definitely.
Like, how do different groups actually respond to this blend of poetry and social commentary and everything else he's doing?
It all comes back to Stuart Hall, doesn't it?
Good old Stuart Hall.
With his reception theory.
Yeah. Like, there's no single right way to interpret a text, is there?
Not at all. It depends on the audience, their background, their experiences.
So, like, someone who grew up in London might have a totally different understanding of the podcast compared to someone from a rural village.
Exactly. Or someone who's experienced racial discrimination.
Right.
Their interpretation might be totally different from someone who's never had to deal with that.
And I think that's why that Common Ground platform is so genius.
Oh, totally.
It creates this space where those different interpretations can live side by side,
Yeah, and people can talk about them.
debate them, learn from each other.
It's acknowledging that there are multiple truths, multiple perspectives.
And isn't that kind of what we need more of these days?
I think so.
Especially in our increasingly polarized world.
Yeah, we need spaces for open dialogue, for understanding.
And, Common Ground kind of reminds me of Henry Jenkins and his work on fandom.
Oh, yeah.
I see that connection.
It's like they're creating a fandom around this podcast.
A community of people who are passionate about the issues, about the art.
And they're not just passively consuming, they're actively creating.
Yeah, they're contributing to the conversation.
Exactly, which is so important.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the BBC and their commitment to diversity.
Mm-hmm.
But are they really living up to it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Have you heard George's podcast? Like,
Yeah.
a genuine step forward? Or is it just a token gesture?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, it's definitely a positive thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's giving a platform to diverse voices, tackling these important social issues.
But it's just one podcast, right?
Yeah, and the BBC is a huge institution.
So it's hard to say whether this represents a real systemic shift or if it's just like a one-off success story.
I think we need to see more.
Yeah.
More podcasts like this, more diversity across all their programming.
And not just in front of the microphone, but behind the scenes too,
Okay.
right?
Absolutely. In the writers' rooms, in the production teams, at all levels of the organization.
Okay, so diversity is a work in progress. But it feels like, have you heard George's podcast? Is a step in the right direction, at least.
I think so, yeah. And it's definitely sparked important conversations.
Which is what we need.
Exactly. It's making us think critically about the media we consume.
And about the world around us.
Right. And that's a good thing.
And it's all happening within this really interesting social and cultural moment, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
We're living in a time where issues of diversity and inclusion are finally getting the attention they deserve.
Yeah, after years of being ignored or marginalized.
And it feels like events like Black Lives Matter and the Grenfell Tower fire, they've really pushed these issues to the forefront of public consciousness.
They've forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our society.
And have you heard George's podcast? It feels like a direct response to that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's engaging with these issues head on.
Giving voice to those who have been silenced.
And challenging us to think about how we can create a more just and equitable world.
And, it's not just about diversity, it's about power,
Yeah,
too.
for sure.
Who has the power to tell stories?
Whose voices get heard?
Whose experiences are valued?
Those are big questions, and have you heard George's podcast is forcing us to grapple with them.
Which is why it's so important.
Absolutely.
And, we've been talking about how the BBC is adapting to this changing media landscape.
Yeah, with podcasts and online platforms and all that.
But are there other examples you can think of?
Of traditional media embracing new forms of storytelling.
Yeah.
Let me think.
Like, are other public service broadcasters around the world doing similar things?
I'm sure they are. I mean, the media landscape is changing everywhere.
Right.
And those institutions that want to stay relevant, they have to adapt.
So it's not just about survival. It's about using these new platforms to really fulfill their public service mission.
Exactly. Reaching new audiences, telling new stories, engaging with the world in new ways.
I'm excited to see what the future holds.
Me too. It's an exciting time to be in media, that's for sure.
And it's all about being open to new possibilities, isn't it?
Absolutely. Experimenting, innovating, pushing boundaries.
And most importantly, listening.
Yes. Listening to those voices that have been marginalized, to those stories that haven't been told.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this part, haven't we?
We have. From media theory to audience reception to the future of public service broadcasting.
But there's still more to come.
I know. I'm ready for part 3.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Have You Heard George's podcast? And I think it's time we really get into the nitty-gritty, you know?
Yeah, let's dig into the actual content.
We've danced around it talking about all these theories in the BBC and stuff.
Frameworks and all that.
Right. But now I want to talk about like what actually makes this podcast so special.
Agreed.
I mean, we've mentioned the format a bit, right?
Yeah, how it's so different.
It's not just your typical interview podcast.
No, not at all.
It's got the storytelling, the poetry, the music, the social commentary, all mixed together.
It's a really bold approach.
Yeah. And especially coming from the BBC, right?
Right. You don't really expect that from them, do you?
They're usually a bit more like traditional.
Heat up.
Yeah. But this is something else.
It's fresh.
Yeah. And it really works, doesn't it?
It does. It keeps you on the edge of your seat.
It's engaging.
Yeah, you never know what's coming next.
And it makes you think.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It challenges you to see things from a different perspective.
And that's all thanks to George the Poet, isn't it?
Definitely. He's a true innovator.
He's not afraid to experiment, to take risks.
He's pushing the boundaries of what a podcast can be.
You know, there was one episode that really hit me hard.
Which one?
A Grenfell story.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
It's about the Grenfell Tower fire, right?
Yeah, a truly devastating tragedy.
And this episode, it does such a beautiful job of honoring the victims.
It gives them a voice.
Yeah, and it centers the experiences of the community.
Those who were directly affected.
It avoids any kind of, like, voyeurism or sensationalism.
No exploit.
No, it's all about empathy and understanding.
It's about letting those voices be heard.
And it makes you think about, like, the bigger picture, you know?
Systemic issues that led to the tragedy.
The failures that allowed it to happen.
It's a call to action.
Yeah, it's not just a story, it's a statement.
And that commitment to social justice, it runs throughout the entire podcast.
Yeah, it's not just a one-off thing.
George the Poet, he's tackling all these complex issues.
Economic inequality, racial injustice.
The impact of crime on communities.
And he does it in a way that feels so personal.
Yeah, he's drawing on his own experiences.
But it's also universal, you know?
It speaks to these broader truths about our society.
It's that combination, I think, that makes it so powerful.
The personal and the political.
Yeah, it's not just dry facts and figures.
It's about real people, real stories.
And it brings us back to that idea of dialogue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is why Common Ground is such a brilliant addition to the podcast.
It takes the conversation beyond the episodes.
It's a space for listeners to connect, share their thoughts, get creative.
It's like a virtual community center.
It's using technology to amplify those marginalized voices.
And to build bridges between people.
It's really inspiring, isn't it?
It is. It shows the potential of what podcasts can do.
They're not just entertainment. They can be tools for social change.
For education, for connection.
And have you heard George's podcast?
Yeah.
It's really pushing those boundaries.
It's a sign of things to come, I think.
Like, podcasts are still relatively new, right?
Yeah, they're still evolving.
We're only just starting to see what they can do.
It's an exciting time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question.
Okay.
What other podcasts out there are doing this kind of work?
Pushing the boundaries, challenging the status quo.
Whose voices are you listening to?
And what voices do you think deserve to be heard more widely?
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Have You Heard George's podcast. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore.